Okay, Gary, you should start. And I will turn you on here.
Okay, I can do that, Charlie.
Okay.
Welcome. Kathy, are you on too?
Yes, I am here.
You want to lead off and then I'll follow up.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Davis. I am a Vice President of All Aboard Washington, and I welcome you all to our Rail Summit. And with no further ado, I am going to let Gary Wirt tell you more about our project. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm Gary Wirt. I'm a member of All Aboard Washington, and I'm also the co-chairman of our East-West team, which is leading our effort to restore passenger rail service through Eastern Washington. And welcome, everyone. I'm a retired U.S. Department of Transportation employee after 35 years. I live in Yakima, Washington. For those of you not familiar with the area, Yakima is a city of 90,000 in the central portion of the state. Yakima County has a population of 250,000, and it is the largest metropolitan area in the state of Washington without passenger rail service. There are two other Yakima participants here with me this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce them. First is Verlyn Best. Verlyn is the president and CEO of the Greater Yakima Chamber of Commerce, who is a co-sponsor of our meeting. You want to say hello, Verlyn?
Hello, this is Verlyn Best from the Chamber.
And our second representative is Alan Adolph. Alan is the manager of metropolitan planning and regional transportation planning for the Yakima Valley Conference of Governments, which represents the transportation interests of 15 jurisdictions within Yakima County. Alan will be speaking to us during the second half of today's meeting. Alan, you want to say hello?
Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to virtual Yakima from the Conference of Governments.
Thanks, Alan. As Charlie said, in case some of you are just coming online, if you have questions, we're going to have two question periods, one at the end of the first hour and one at the end of the second hour. So post your questions in the chat box, please, and we will be answering those. For the first half, that will be at the end of the STEER presentation, which is coming up right now. So with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Luis Moscoso. Luis is a former U.S. United States, Washington State House of Representatives from 2011 to 2017. And Luis is now the Government Affairs Director for All Aboard Washington. Welcome, Luis, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to see the growing interest in restoring passenger rail service to Central and Eastern Washington. I first became aware of this issue when I was vice chair of the House Transportation Committee. And it was a big part of the motivation for me to help start the Legislative Rail Caucus 7 years ago after participating in several tours of rail corridors in Central and Eastern Washington. As a former West Side suburban legislator with a background in public transit, to learn about the possibility of restoring intercity rail was most enlightening. I'd like to introduce a former colleague of mine, Senator Judy Warnick of the 13th Legislative District. The senator is co-chair of the Legislative Rail Caucus and prime sponsor of our 2019 transportation budget proviso that funded this study. Senator Warnick, would you say a little bit about yourself and your view on restoring passenger rail service to Eastern Washington?
You bet. Thank you, Luis. Luis is very persuasive. He has kept my interest going over the years. And the first person that actually made me think about restoring rail service was actually my mother. She loved to travel by rail. She really did. And she traveled all over the United States because she felt safe on a passenger train. And then my former seatmate from the 13th Legislative District also piqued my interest in it. And speaking of my district, that map that was up on the screen at the very beginning showing what were the areas we're talking about, my district fits right there. My district goes from the top of Snoqualmie Pass, from King County line all the way to Spokane County line. So with all the different discussions that we've had and studies that we've had in the past, I thought, we need to do a little bit more. And rail is a passion for a lot of folks. In my district alone, we have the Ellensburg Depot that's been restored very passionately by Steve Hayden, and the Inland Northwest Rail Museum in Reardon. A lot of folks working on that. So rail is kind of in my blood and in my district.
Thank you, Senator. Can you say a little more about, I remember a tour I did once in Eastern Washington. We had a little chat there mostly about freight at that time.
Yes.
But I know I was trying to ask questions about how public transportation, particularly rail, is something that used to be was available in Eastern Washington, at least up until 1981 when the Empire Builder went down that corridor. And we've seen a lot of interest the last few years with the work that All Aboard, Gary, and others have been doing over there. It's amazing to think that with folks even on the west side and across the country now getting excited about rail in various ways, that it does seem to be something that this country is looking towards. Obviously, the state of Washington is doing the same. Would you agree or have any concern about how much effort we should really put into looking at the benefits of passenger rail in the future?
Well, I think passenger rail, especially with this east-west study that we've done, it'll connect the two sides of our state better than we have right now. I-90, Highway 12, the other highways are not always available for folks to use because of weather, because of other issues. But and Luis, you came on that tour when we were looking at freight mobility. Some of the areas that we have, the infrastructure we have right now in some of our Eastern Washington areas, we can only go about 25 miles an hour. So looking at the infrastructure that would be available for passenger rail especially is very, very important. Our tourism, we'd like to open that up more. We'd like to open it up for students. Central Washington University is in my district. I share Yakima with two other senators, Senator Honeyford, Senator King, and I know that Yakima, Walla Walla areas, connecting to Walla Walla areas and other areas, for the wine industry, the tourism industry would be a huge benefit, and just our seniors being able to travel back and forth safely, just like my mother used to do.
Yes, I remember that during the session early this year, running into a lot of legislators from Eastern Washington, and a lot more interest than I'd heard in previous years, bringing up the same subject you just mentioned now.
Yeah.
It's really going to be important to marshal all those concerns and see how we can convince the legislature to keep looking at this, because clearly it's something we need. We've got to figure out how we might do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we have to move on right now. So thank you, Senator, for your time. And
thank you.
Hope you can enjoy as much of the show as you can.
I will.
I know you're interested in
on
study.
and maybe hop back on a little bit for some of the budget discussion as well. So
that would be wonderful.
I'm going to listen to it and hear what you have to say. So thank you very much, Luis.
Thanks again. Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce Dave Catterson. He's the Joint Transportation Committee Coordinator and lead staff to the East-West Intercity Passenger Rail Study we're talking about today. It was a pleasure working with Dave these past 9 months, and we're looking forward to hearing STEER's report that was recently submitted to the committee. Dave, are you ready?
I am. Are you hearing me?
We sure are.
All right, great.
Thank you.
So yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Catterson, staff for the Joint Transportation Committee. I'm just really quickly going to tell you more about the JTC for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are and what we do. So the Joint Transportation Committee is part of the Washington State Legislature. Our work is directed by an executive committee of 4 legislators. They're the chairs and the ranking members of the House and Senate Transportation Committees. Excuse me. So right now that's Representative Fye and Representative Barkus. Both of those gentlemen are on your agenda later today. And then in the Senate, it's Senator Hobbs and Senator King. So by design, the JTC is a bipartisan, bicameral agency of the legislature. One of the primary things we do is conduct or oversee studies that get assigned to us in the transportation budget. So the end result of these studies are reports that we submit to the legislature, to the House and the Senate Transportation Committees. So legislators are the primary audience for our studies. But obviously the reports are also of interest to the public, and every report that we produce at the JTC is available on the JTC website, including the report from this study. You can find the final report that was posted last week. The study you're about to hear about today, feasibility of East-West passenger rail service, intercity passenger rail service for Washington State, was assigned to the JTC in the 2019-21 transportation budget. That's the one that passed during the 2019 legislative session. For the study, we contracted with the Steer Consulting Group. They were the lead consultants. They worked with David Evans and Associates as sub-consultants. And now you're going to hear from Michael Colella from Steer, who will give an overview of the study report.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Dave said, thank you for inviting me to give you a sort of a bit more of a flavor and a color regarding the work that we've been doing for the JTC and Dave for the last 9 months. I'm Michael Colella. I am Steer's head of North America advisory. My background is 25 years plus in the transportation industry, mixture of working in the UK, working for Transport for London, one of the big rail operators in the UK called Stagecoach, and who also is part owns Virgin Trains. And also with the Port Authority of New Jersey. I have a lot of experience in developing and building sort of projects like AirTrain projects to JFK and Newark airports. I worked closely with the Washington DOT last year on the ultra-high speed feasibility study that you probably will remember, which showed a very favorable light in terms of the ability of rail to transform a regional economy and how it could actually also obviously provide a number of other benefits. And we are currently also doing some work for the state of California and Caltrans in terms of how they can best improve their services, particularly in this period of the lockdowns of COVID. So that's kind of a bit of a background for me, and also a little bit of Steer. We've been in the business for about 40 years. And so I will start to show you some slides, which hopefully will not only inform a bit more about the project, but also fundamentally hopefully we'll also build a bit of conversation. So can you see my screen?
Yep. Everything's
okay.
Looking good.
Great. Okay. So I will go through this now. So the first step is, let me just get rid of that. So we were asked by the JTC to look at 5 key aspects in terms of potentially reintroducing services on the Stampede Pass corridor to provide a service between Seattle, the Yakima and Kittitas Valleys, Pasco, and then up to Spokane. So that was obviously for the first time in a long time to do a fundamental review of what the potential ridership and revenue would be for a service, to look at what the service options would be. You know, is it a daily service? Is it a twice daily service? What would be, and what stations it should be stopping at. Looking at the infrastructure constraints that are currently on the pass in particular, but also on all sections of the line, and see what investments would need to be made in order to allow passenger trains to be reintroduced. We did a work and survey of the community, focusing particularly in the communities in the valley, and we also did and were asked to look at how would this potentially be operated. So I'll go through each one of these now for the next few slides. So I guess the first key message I think that comes out of this is the work that we did would suggest that actually reintroducing a service, whether it's a daily service or twice daily service, is feasible. So there shouldn't be, provided there's enough investment, there shouldn't be any reason why a service can't be reintroduced along the whole route or part of the route. We looked at daily and twice daily services. The key issues, though, that we did highlight, which I think everybody's aware of, is that because of the significant gradients along much of the Stampede Pass and a number of sharp curves, the journey times will be quite long, and effectively will be longer than air, auto, or bus for most of the city-to-city pairs that exist along the route. And that we did a lot of this work based on developing and validating the various service patterns, working with David Evans Associates through a strategic timetabling software called Attune, which is something that Steer helped develop for the UK market and European market, but we have now started to use it in a number of different situations, including on the ultra-high-speed study last year, but also on existing rail lines in Boston and in Canada, both in Toronto and in Vancouver. So I think that sort of the takeaway from this particular slide, though, is to say a service can be introduced twice daily along the full route, but that journey times would be long. Now, then the real focus of the work that we did was to look at the ridership. So the ridership forecast, we basically built a mode choice model, which gives you a sort of a bottom-up assessment of how a new service like an East-West passenger rail service would compete against the main modes. And where focus was on auto trips, primarily because based on all the analysis and data that we worked on, air and intercity bus services have much less demand, but also because it felt like, based on all the work that we did, including the stated preference surveys, we did a number of those to try to get an indication from people who live along the route or work along the route, whether they have any particular views and what would be the issues and things that would have to happen in order for them to change from their current mode, auto, to the East-West Rail. Now, in terms of the ridership forecast, a twice daily service between Seattle and Spokane would generate about 205,000 trips in basically, and the way the forecast has been built is based on it opening today, albeit in reality, as we know, it would take probably about 5 years if the state decided to put the money forward for it in order for it to be introduced. That would suggest that it would be comparable to a number of the Amtrak's current Amtrak state-supported services, but it would obviously, on a twice-daily basis, still be generating quite a bit fewer trips than the Amtrak Cascade route, which runs with 4 trains a day between Seattle and Portland, and 2 trains a day between Seattle and Vancouver. Revenues are relatively low, but that's largely because we use an Amtrak fare pricing package, which would be well understood by people, and also it was easier to model. I think the important thing that comes out of this, though, is that most of the demand is within or around the Yakima Valley location. So particularly trips between Yakima and Toppenish. And what I mean by that is one of the few city-to-city pairs where the new service would be time competitive with not just auto, but also with bus is that journey. So that, I think, is an important point. Should I go on, or because I see that some people might be asking questions. Let me just have a look. I can agree. I've sent already to Charles the PowerPoint slides, so you'll be able to see those and share those later after this meeting. So I'll go to the next slide. So now, one of the big challenges that we investigated and try to get a better understanding of what it would take to reintroduce services on the Stampede Pass was the amount of investment that would be needed in infrastructure improvements, which would include additional passing loops, some resilience features along the route, and to reintroduce stations across the route. As part of the proviso, we were asked to look at 4 station new station locations, which you saw on the map. The amount of investment that is needed is quite significant, in large part because of the heavy freight use by BNSF, mainly for empty freight, intermodal and other freight services. But that does suggest that actually, in order to minimize the amount of conflict between the two, there would be a need to put in additional passing tracks. That would cost potentially up to 75 million based on an estimate that we worked on with David Evans. Likewise, we think the 4 new stations plus improvements at existing stations like Pasco would cost around 50 million if we were going to run a 4-car service, potentially significantly more on an 8-coach service, in large part because that would mean extending platforms at a couple of the existing stations like Pasco. To run the service, particularly a twice daily service, you would need to purchase or procure new trains. So based on going rates that Caltrans and the Midwest are currently doing in terms of procuring intercity fleet, that could cost as much as 250 million. And you would then also need about 30 million of additional train maintenance facilities, given the fact that you would need to have at least some maintenance facilities and sidings at the eastern end of the route, whether that's in Spokane or Pasco or Toppenish, depending on the service option. And you would also need to probably do some improvements to expand capacity in Seattle, given that Amtrak and Sounder are already quite heavily occupying the maintenance facilities to the south of King Street. And last but not least, there would be operating costs, and that would be somewhere between 6 million and 30 million per year, which, if you compare with the revenues that I mentioned a slide ago, would mean it would be loss-making. So, in terms of one of the other key factors, though, is that we did a fair amount of community work. As I said, we did the stated preference surveys. We also had some focus groups that looked at this. The bar, the sort of pie element that you see in the middle is based on the participants and the stated preference survey work. What it does indicate is there's quite a lot of community support, whether it's for people and businesses, for reintroduction of service, quite a high level. We've done this type of work in feasibility work for other states and other routes in recently in the past, and 76% is one of the highest that we've seen for any kind of sort of community engagement that we've done in the past. And likewise, very little in terms of people that actually saw this as a bad idea, so only about 4%. That is also particularly low given our experience in other parts of the country. So the last point that I wanted to mention was around operator options. So we looked at a couple of different options associated with that. We came to the conclusion that there were 3 broad options that could be done. So one would be the most straightforward, you could say, and one that is most well used around the United States, which is effectively that the state would contract operations to Amtrak in the same way that other state-supported services are contracted, including the Cascades. The assets, though, including the rolling stock, the stations, would be funded and owned by the state of Washington. A second option, which hasn't been used for intercity rail services in the US, but is been explored by a number of states and is being used extensively by a number of commuter rail operators, including the big California operators, MBTA in Boston, is actually contract it to a third party or private operator. There are a number of these operators around the United States. Some of them are, that includes companies called like Keolis, Virgin Trains, Herzog, and they would actually develop and deliver the service. And like the public outsourcing option, the assets would be most likely still owned by the state, But there is a possibility that you could wrap a lot of the investment, particularly the trains, through an option, basically through a P3 option to sort of spread the costs to the public over a longer period of time. The last option we raise, partly because it is feasible, even though I do recognize that this is a major undertaking if the state was to do this, is actually the state itself could operate the services. It could set up an internal company to design, deliver, and operate. It would most likely only make sense if the state of Washington also wanted to actually take back into state operation the Cascade services. I think on its own, it probably doesn't make sense, but in combination with the Cascades, I think you could make the case for this. It does mean, though, that the state would have to build up a capability which it doesn't necessarily have at the moment. A sub-option for that, as I've mentioned at the last bullet there, is that Washington DOT takes more control over activities, whether it's an outsourced contract to Amtrak or an outsourced contract to a private operator. And that's more aligned to what California does with its joint powers authorities, particularly the Joint Power Authority who does the Capital Corridor. They effectively run almost everything or are responsible for almost everything, and they only use Amtrak actually as an operational function and a bit of ability, obviously, in terms of collecting and generating fare box revenue. So the last two slides are just a summary that you see in the main report, which shows all the key indicators, including the number of services, where the options would go from and to, what the investment would be, required, what revenue would be generated, and the ridership in thousands. This is for the daily service options. And then likewise, there's one for the twice daily options. And with that, I am done. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm really happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Michael. So we did get a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is, what about empty coal cart, empty coal transport on this line will decrease significantly after 2025. What will be the impacts on this line when that happens? Is there anything known about that?
We as part of the work that we did early on in the study, we worked with David Evans Associates, who knows and works for BNSF extensively around some of the future, I guess you could say, freight service scenarios that could potentially be operating on the Stampede Pass. We didn't get a very clear view, I think, in large part because BNSF was probably being a bit conservative with their views. They thought actually that even if coal was to decrease, there would be a continued increase in terms of intermodal traffic. So basically sending onto the Stampede Pass basically empty container trains. So they thought it was the baseline would at least be the same number of services that currently operate. And secondly, the question they thought was that actually there would still be an increase in services. So that's the kind of flavor for it. So I guess you could say no clear indication that that was going to have a material impact in terms of the number of freight trains on the service. And then the second thing was, even if there was a material reduction in number of freight services as on the Stampede Pass, would that have reduced the amount of requirement in infrastructure investment like passing loops? I think the answer is no. In large part because while we did a lot of our timetabling analysis on the basis of effectively an hourly freight train operating on the Stampede Pass and then basically intermix the east-west passenger train on top of that, even if it went down to say it was cut in half and it was basically a freight train every 2 hours, at least in the middle of the day, I don't think that necessarily would mean that there would be any fewer passing loops that would be required. And those are the main investments along with the stations and the trains themselves.
Alrighty, thank you very much for that. let's see, the next one. I saw a note on the slide that there wasn't much of a chance to speed up the journey time. Why is that?
So a couple of reasons. In large part, it's because of just the geographic location and conditions that the Stampede Pass corridor operates in, and also limited opportunities on the far, on the Seattle end and also on the Pasco to Spokane end. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. I think most of you know this better than I do, that the Stampede Pass is a very steeply graded line. It has a number of sharp curves. So the only way you could significantly speed up the service, well, there are three options. One would be to effectively build a series of bypass lines. And I've seen some that actually have been proposed in the past that are in the sort of public domain on the internet. But obviously that would cost hundreds of millions, if not billions, depending on what the option is. So we weren't asked to look into that. So we didn't look into that. Second option would be to effectively to provide and procure different types of rolling stock, which actually would be more like the Talgo trains, which are operated on the Cascade route. That could potentially reduce journey times, but there were some DEA were concerned that actually the Talgo equipment may not necessarily be able to operate on the Stampede Pass route because of some of the lightweight nature of the equipment. Now that could be argued in a number of different ways. All I'm just suggesting is what we decided that we would be able to do, we used as an assumption, was to basically find good modern passenger train equipment that is currently being introduced in other parts of the United States. So possibly a lighter weight train that potentially could also run faster on the curves would potentially have a benefit. But again, it gets into an issue about the conflicts with freight services. So the ability to actually speed it up significantly is it might be limited. The third option, which only would save maybe 15 or 20 minutes, would be, as part of the station works, to basically make all the stations high-level platforms. That would have the ability to basically significantly reduce station dwell times, and combined with maybe a better acceleration and deceleration into the stations, you could potentially take about 15 minutes off the journey time. That again, we didn't look into because it's not, other than on the Northeast Corridor, on a couple of very high intensity routes, high level platforms are not normally introduced, and they can be quite expensive to introduce. So yeah, but we did test a model which said if you can hypothetically reduce the journey time by an hour, which is closer to how the old services back pre-1981 used to operate, what would that do to demand? It didn't significantly shift demand. And that's largely because of the question I mentioned at the beginning, which is that the journey times by East West Rail would still be significantly slower than auto, air, or bus for a number of the city pairs. So I hope that answers the question, though a second stage of this study could look into some of those options in a bit more detail.
Okay. Let's see. Another question, could there be cost or operational savings looking beyond Seattle and Spokane, such as Seattle to Boise on an interstate effort?
We were asked to look into that. So it would be hard for me to say whether it would have a significant impact. I would probably say, based on my professional experience, the synergy impact on economies of scale is probably pretty limited, because the main cost of operating the service is the train crews, the fuel cost for the locomotives, and then as I mentioned, the infrastructure costs, which are effectively specific to the line, plus the purchase of the trains. One thing, though, I would say, which could be a savings, well, there's two. One is that we assumed, because we haven't had detailed negotiations with BNSF, and given the sharp gradients on the route, that BNSF would effectively require each train to have 2 locomotives. That is a cost, as you would understand, and it may be that, particularly for a fur coach service, which is what we think demand would be more matching to the demand, that actually you could operate this service on with one locomotive. That would significantly reduce the train equipment costs, not by, you know, it wouldn't cut it in half, but it would cut it down by a significant amount. And in terms of running costs, that would reduce things. The other point that I would say is that we didn't look into in any real investigation what the costs and synergies there would be by effectively managing the fleet with the Cascade fleet in a more, you know, sort of holistic manner, or even the Coast Starlight. And again, that could save a bit of money, but again, it'd probably be in the low millions, not in the sort of tens of millions.
Let's see. There's one talking about induced ridership. We understand personally from having read the study that wasn't included in there, but we found some Amtrak information suggesting that that could be as high as 11%. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so when we did our state of preference survey work, one of the things that became clear was that that the long journey times of the service was not considered particularly attractive in terms of changing people's behavior, in terms of making more or different trips than they currently do. Now, and based on our experience in other routes, and I'll use the ultra high speed example because that was a really useful analysis that we did just over a year ago for Washington DOT. We looked at induced demand on that factor, on that route, where because ultra high speed was very time competitive and you'd be able to get from Vancouver to Seattle in an hour or from Vancouver to Portland in 2 hours, that generated a fair amount of induced demand, somewhere between 12% and 20%. Now, the Amtrak number of 11% effectively is in areas like the Northeast Corridor, where rail is not just time competitive, but actually is actually significantly quicker than most, if not all, other options. East-West Rail is just not in that spectrum. So that's one of the reasons why, as part of the analysis that we did not look at induced demand. Now, we have just done a study somewhere else in the US, again in an area where intercity rail would be more time competitive, but not necessarily step change of service like an ultra high speed or a Acela service. And that generated about 2 to 3% induced demand. So you could, if you could say that our numbers are conservative, and I wouldn't disagree with that, I would say that induced demand would only add a couple thousand to 5,000 passengers a day based on the 2020 demand number. So it's not going to change the dynamics in any significant way.
I see.
Yeah.
Let's see. A couple of people have been asking about intermediate stops between Pasco and Spokane, and that's something I also understand was not necessarily within the scope of the study. But the comment says here, you did not include stops at Connell and Cheney. These would seem to have an advantage since the Empire Builder does not provide such service. I also understand Ritzville is along the way and kind of an intermediate point. Was there any discussion about those stops and what they could add?
There was a discussion, as Patrick, you're correct in saying it wasn't included in the proviso for the study. So we ended up not including it into our analysis. So we think actually that would be quite an interesting thing to look at again as for a future stage of work on the basis that the state would like to take this forward. It probably again wouldn't change the dynamics in terms of the overall ridership much, except for in one particular aspect, and that is if some of those towns have similar sort of demographics as the Kittias and Yakima Valley route stations, where actually a new service like East West Rail would be time competitive, say with any bus or taxi or other kind of trips for those local journeys, that could generate a few trips. But the towns themselves are not not significantly large, and so I would say probably we're talking about low thousands of additional passengers a day. But like I said, it wasn't in the proviso, so hence we didn't look at it in any detail.
Alrighty, here's another one. Did your ridership estimates consider the cost of all other options? For example, the cost of air travel from Yakima to Seattle, ranging, between sometimes as high as $287 or even $440, and taking about 4.5 hours. Yeah.
So we did. Our mode choice model does take into account a number of different factors that influences people's mode choice. So obviously journey time and also time of day. The other very important factor within that is price. So we used fairly standard Amtrak pricing, which is for most, which is competitive and lower than air, but air has such a significant time benefit for most, in most trips, that we didn't see any real shift. And as I mentioned in the presentation, we didn't look at air travel other than to just be able to, in terms of modeling it in a bottom-up way, in large part because based on the early analysis, we could see that most people who take air are time sensitive and are less price sensitive. Again, for a future study, that could be looked at again, but our early work suggested that very few, if any, people, anybody who is flying at the moment to Seattle would not fly if East-West Rail was introduced. Particularly because a number of people are actually also flying to Seattle for the purposes of connecting onto longer distance flights, to California or anywhere else in the world.
Alrighty.
I saw there about the 4 hours and 30 minutes. Well, I would say two things. One is that takes into account a very long transfer time at Seattle, which isn't always all the services. And secondly, based on the analysis that we saw in terms of the number of people who do it, very few people do fly between Yakima and Spokane. It's in the low thousands per annum. So again, even if 100% of those people did come on the basis that it was roughly, a worse time on air would be roughly competitive with East-West Rail, that would only still be generating, less than 10,000 trips extra a year. I don't think it changes the dynamic is again the question, but it is worth investigating at a further study.
Okay, here's one. And this one I'm not as familiar with, so I'm not quite sure because I read through, at least part of the study. But did you consider the transfer of ridership that currently travels between Seattle and Pasco specifically to increase due to time savings by avoiding either a Portland or Spokane route? I think that, yeah, they're talking about getting to the Tri-Cities. If you're coming from Seattle, let's say, to the Tri-Cities, that avoiding the connection in Portland to get on Fire Builder. How was that?
We did look at whether there were, based on existing trips on Amtrak, their database, whether there were any trips between those two. We couldn't find any substantive numbers. So I'm not saying that nobody does it, but I would imagine that it's sporadic. So on a daily, basis, or it would be very small. I can look again to see whether actually whether there's any numbers in our actual annual numbers. But we did look at it at the beginning of the study, and we couldn't find any regular pattern of people taking the Coast Starlight down to, or the Cascades down to Portland, and then the Empire Builder that way. But yeah, we can look again about that, and I'll double check.
Okay, yeah, I'll just say, just as a little anecdote, I do know one person who has done that before, but yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of data to look into that for that.
Yeah.
And this one, I guess, isn't directed just to you, but I guess this can kind of open it up to maybe other people who, because I think this is directed toward everybody. Who among the participants have actually used any of the existing trains? I've used all of them except for the Spokane to Seattle Builder several times. That's probably a good thing to know, just to get a sense of who among the the meeting speakers have actually ridden these trains.
So part of when we did some of our work in I think it was I'm just trying to remember the timings of when we did it. I think it was late last year when we did some of the community events and the state of preference survey. Some of my team actually did fly into Yakima Valley and Pasco. And I know that at least one of my team did actually take the Empire Builder from Spokane to Pasco, or Pasco to Spokane, because they then flew some from there. I have used the Cascade services on a number of occasions, and I've also used the Coast Starlight. So I have experience of Washington services, but not necessarily the Empire Builder. That would be my answer.
Are there any other participants who would like to chime in on this?
It looks like Adol's trying.
Yeah, Alan and Gary, if you're both trying to speak, you're both muted.
This is Alan. I did have a question with regards to the train depots, the costs. Is the cost that's listed in the report based on entirely new facilities, or is there still possibilities of cost savings due to existing facilities that could be updated at a much reduced cost, thus bringing that operational cost down? Example I give is Topinish's facility. Even though the depot now is acting as a museum, they have indicated the ability to still handle operations with the existing facility with potentially a far lower cost than what's listed in the report.
So it's a good question. We, at the beginning of the study, one of the things that we made a decision with, in particular with David Evans Associates, was to take a view that none of the historic stations along the route would be reused, and that was for a couple of reasons. One, because they are all they're not currently in railroad or public ownership. So there would be a cost and a community impact for taking them back. And we thought that was not the way to start. David Evans also thought that the locations for some of those existing stations would actually be more difficult to actually build the platforms in order to provide a station access to and from the train, which would be not just cost effective, but actually would be usable because of either the gap between the train and the platform being too long, or because of the location vis-a-vis where the curves on the route were. So again, I would say a future phase of study could look into this. We decided that, again, our effort should focus on underlying ridership and operational matters in terms of how you would do it. That might be a way to save money, because I would accept that, for instance, the assessment, which is based on some Amtrak stations that have been recently built in the West, is quite high. That it is a conservative number, and it does include effectively a fair amount of contingency within that 20 million, which was the number effectively that is presented in the report. So there could be some savings there. But at this stage, we decided that you needed to just understand what the sort of the full order of magnitude could be for reducing services, and not to assume that we could, for instance, acquire an old historic station, which might not necessarily be ultimately deliverable for one reason or another, and might not be operationally the best solution. Likewise, I saw in the questions about the depots. One of the things that we talked about with Washington DOT was the tightness of the facilities in and around Seattle, hence why we added some additional costs associated with that. Again, I know that Sounder is looking at a new facility which would reduce pressure on that facility, which might mean that 1 or 2 extra train sets could be maintained there at effectively no extra cost, but you would still need a remote, or you would still need a maintenance facility of some sort, even if it's just light servicing and repairs, at the eastern end, because that does not exist, and that wouldn't be something that that would still cost low millions, and potentially if you needed to also put in a siding, you would be still getting into the sort of 10 million number. So again, you could maybe save 15, 20 million if the Seattle issues could be resolved, but it wouldn't come down to zero.
This is Alan again. One more question. It had to do with the ridership projections with Toppenish and Yakima. If I recall right, looking back up, you're looking at well over 100,000 with referencing Seattle Toppenish, but only about 31,000 referencing Seattle Yakima. Is that $90,000 to $100,000 ridership difference? Is that purely ridership between Yakima and Toppenish?
Yes, almost entirely, yes. There is also a few passengers who are obviously going from Toppenish to another destination on the route. So further in, so it could be Auburn. There'll certainly be a few, and I can double check, but there'll certainly be a few passengers who will be going to Seattle. But I think based on the research that just to look at our data, that roughly 80% of that increase between those two options is people traveling between those two. And the reasons for that are based on the modeling that we did, that is around a 16-minute journey. That 16-minute journey would be very time competitive with auto. It would be very time competitive with bus. And there is also quite limited bus options in the valleys. And so therefore, in my mind, we saw that as actually quite two things that pops up from that. One, which is there is a lack of adequate non-auto options in terms of trying to get around Yakima and Toppenish and Chelum and all that. And I think that kind of got flagged up as part of our modeling. And secondly, that those communities probably have a pent-up demand to do something to not travel by auto, but that for longer distance journeys like to Seattle or to Spokane, that wouldn't be necessarily a route that they would normally consider in terms of a regular travel pattern.
Okay, but that would also mean your analysis would stop at whether starting in Yakima or Toppenish, that your analysis stops at Spokane and does not consider ridership beyond Spokane to places east that would see those numbers increase.
Correct. And again, I think a future stage of study could look into that in terms of sort of the interlining benefits of if you can get the timings right of connecting with the Empire Builder, but the Empire Builder does go through Spokane, at quite early or quite late. And so therefore the ability to interline between those two might be quite limited, but again, that would be something that could be looked at in a future phase of study to see if you could at least get one of the two daily services to better connect with that, with the Empire Builder as it goes through Spokane.
We have time for one more question before the break. After the break, we'll be talking about what the next steps will be in order to move this forward. But so if there is someone that has one more question, please unmute yourself and bring it in.
Sure, this is Abe. I have a question about why ridership per service scenario was not reported by station. So, a legislator looking at the Yakima to Seattle option sees 30,000 riders, and then you see a Spokane to Seattle option of 200,000 riders. And yet there's not really a good sense of how the ridership kind of fluctuates throughout the corridor. And this is especially kind of brought out given the answer to the last question, talking about a significant amount of ridership between Toppenish and Yakima. And so I'm curious as to why those numbers and the sub-corridors between cities in each of the options weren't reported in the final version.
The simple answer is, in discussions with the JTC, it was decided that we didn't need to provide that level of detail. We can provide it, but we, talked about whether that provided any significant additional value versus the overall numbers. So we didn't include it as an appendix or otherwise.
That would be extremely useful in talking to legislators as well as extrapolating potential future benefits, I think.
All right. Well, let's take a break for 5 minutes. We do have some really exciting things going on in the second half. So please stay with us. And we look forward to hearing from the rest of the folks on the agenda. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank
we
you, Michael.
very much appreciate it.
You're very, very, very welcome. Have a good day.
We'll see everybody back at 2 o'clock. Well, let's see. Is everybody back with us?
Yes, Gary, go for it.
Okay, let's proceed. Um, so let's go back to Luis, and Luis is going to introduce Abe Zumwalt with All Aboard Washington, who's going to talk about economic cost-benefit analysis. Luis? Did you go have a cigar, Luis?
Looks like he's
So
on.
Abe, are you on? Let me see. Is Abe there? We'll just go
Yeah.
straight to Abe. Let's go straight.
Yes.
Okay, Abe, you want to go ahead? Please.
No, I'm fine too. You bet. Great. So my name is Abe Zumwalt. I'm a Seattle, Washington native. I am a board member of All Aboard Washington, and I am presently a transportation analyst at R.L. Banks and Associates, the oldest railroad consulting firm in the United States. I am here to talk just a little bit today about the numbers in the report and an attempt to contextualize them and say something about what they mean, because we have a couple of numbers out there. We've got 200,000 passengers. We've got several $100 million of capital investment and several $1 million of operational expense contemplated in the STEER report after their thorough work. And I think it's important that we take a minute to think about what these could mean and make an argument for why these figures need to be studied further. So without further ado, we've only had a couple of days to look at this study, but in those couple of days, just taking some rough swag numbers we're going to go through now, you have to think about it this way. For $15 million to $30 million in annual operations costs contemplated in the report, potentially the state will see about $30 million in state savings from car trips avoided. So this is people not dying on the freeways. This is roads that will not need to be maintained to the same rigorous extent, and another potential $7 million in visitor spending. As I said, this is just from a couple of days, some rough swag numbers, but the intent of this analysis is to show that there's something here. So moving on to the next study, we were hemmed in a little by some of STEER's work, and I'm really glad to hear actually that some of that was going to be alleviated, perhaps by data that they have on hand. Jumping to that second bullet there, the regional impacts given only gross ridership estimates. If they actually end up providing ridership by station in each of the proposals, that'll be great. But on top of that, I'm going to talk about a bit how the ridership profile that they contemplated of riders simply driving instead of flying or being induced or taking a bus does not match Amtrak's own data specific to the state of Washington. And the last one is the fact that a proper corridor was not contemplated. And by proper corridor, I'm talking about seeing service that actually occurs sporadically throughout the day, between 4 and 6 trips a day, like you see on the Cascades. We only see 2 trips. And if you look at Amtrak's ridership figures by frequency, you'll note that that ridership actually exponentially increases when frequency is raised between 5 and 6 per day. But that's okay. They did a great job, and we have some numbers to work with. So moving on. The big thing is because STEER estimates contemplate riders specifically diverting from automotive trips, we can look a bit at how this could potentially save the state money. The cost savings of avoided vehicle miles traveled is really underappreciated. Like fish in water, Washingtonian transportation policy is largely spoken from behind the wheel of a car, and therefore does not appreciate just how terrifically expensive driving is. And that's not unique to Washington State. One of the reasons why, while I'm talking, you can't see my face is because actually I'm speaking to you from a bedroom on board the current westbound Empire Builder train. This is appropriate, but also perhaps inconvenient, so I do apologize if you hear any disruption in my talking here. But it's interesting to note that even Zoom put me on safe driving mode, because of course it would assume me drive a car as opposed to being on train. But that said, so huge costs associated with vehicle miles traveled. Driving is expensive. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we look to our neighbors to the north, the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, just on a couple of numbers about associated with vehicle miles traveled. And they came up with some national averages for the United States that were pretty shocking. They contemplated a whole $2 for every vehicle mile traveled. And that's money that's saved if you prevent car trips. Another number that I drew up was 12 cents per mile on accidents and deaths. And that's an extremely conservative number. Some studies say as much as 35 cents per mile avoided would be saved for accidents and deaths. And this is all pretty familiar to us. 40,000 people a year die on US interstates. And there's a huge cost associated with that. And so, you know, not having people on the roads really can add up. So how did we apply those to the STEER estimates? Moving on to the next slide. While STEER only provided gross numbers for ridership, which is somewhat meaningless for local legislators, it also provided this map of origin destination points from the survey it conducted, which serves as a model of how ridership may fluctuate throughout the corridor. So if you multiply Spokane-Seattle ridership numbers by one of these percentages, you come up with an estimate of ridership between a given origin destination pair, and we did that. Let's go on to the next slide. You can see that if we've taken the one train a day and multiplied it by these percentages, and we get some pretty interesting numbers here. You'll note that just on these survey numbers, you know, all of a sudden 200,000 passengers becomes meaningful. Yakima sees close to 30,000 passengers a year. Ellensburg sees close to 21,000. Those numbers themselves don't seem large until you contemplate the fact that only 93,000 people currently live in Yakima. So this tells us that a whole third of the population of Yakima would potentially take this train in a given year, or at least the equivalent of a third of the population of Yakima. Likewise with Ellensburg, 21,000 people live in Ellensburg, and 12,000 of those would take the train. So while we're not saying that half the population of Ellensburg itself would, but the equivalent of half the population of Ellensburg would take this train at the Ellensburg stop. So these are significant numbers. In order to conceptualize the impacts on state travel, estimates must be made as how passengers would use the corridor. This is really the reason why I hope that STEER publishes the numbers that it contemplated in its own report. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Because we have these estimated numbers between city pairs, we can now look at potential mileage saved, because every one of those passengers in the STEER report is theoretically not going to be driving a car. And so we simply took the fastest Google Maps mileage that they would be driving between these 2 points, and then we multiplied that ridership between those 2 points by the average national vehicle occupancy, which is about 1.6 people in every car. Then we multiplied that by our saved vehicle miles traveled for maintenance and safety costs, and that's $2.12. And so a single round trip provided by the state via train would save the state an estimated 33 in road wear and tear, plus savings from responses to highways and statistical deaths. The 12-cent figure, again, used for savings from accidents, is extremely conservative. You have to remember that American trains are 17 times safer than automobiles. And again, some studies estimate the savings to be closer to 3 times that amount. This hasn't even factored in savings from pollution. And so I would say, to quote Abraham Lincoln, I reckon there's something in this. Now, I want to move on and talk a bit about how STEER's presumption of complete diversion from automobiles and nothing else actually deviates from Amtrak's own data. And so if you look at STEER's ridership estimates, they were again derived solely from car trips. Now, Amtrak actually publishes data for every state, so it's local, on what people would do if the train did not exist. These are available. You can Google Amtrak Economic Impact Brochure, and these come up. They're on the second page of every one of those brochures. Let's look at some of these numbers. On to the next slide, please. According to Amtrak's own data, 47% of passengers in Washington state drive. 32% of Amtrak passengers would have otherwise flown. Only 10% would have taken a bus, which is actually, which is consistent with the STEER analysis of the fact that that east-west bus service in Washington state isn't terribly significant. But what is really interesting is that 11% per Amtrak data of passengers is induced. And so this is not the Northeast Corridor, this is in Washington state. Looking at the steer estimate with Amtrak's own numbers would indicate that ridership projections have been understated by half. Now, I don't really think that they've been understated by half. Steer's model is extremely sophisticated and there's a lot of merit to it. But the thing is, there's clearly room to question the idea that ridership would only come from would-be car trips. And this is important because, on to the next slide, if you look at induced ridership, this is really significant for us. Now, it may sound funny to say that passengers who would not travel, but it's a true effect. There are a significant portion of Amtrak passengers that would not make the trips they do without train service. The national average for those figures is 8%, but Washington state, that jumps to 11%, so it's big here. As with all consumer choices, there are myriad reasons as to why this is, but it speaks to the unique qualities of train travel. Note again that they are not interchangeable with buses because only 10% of the Amtrak passengers in Washington state would have otherwise taken a bus. This induced travel is really, really valuable. Let's move on to the next slide.
We're almost out of time, Abe.
Okay, I'll move as fast as I can. Talking to Experience Washington, you look at day trips, every one of them made in Washington state gives us $84. The average for overnight visitors is $366. And so moving on to the next slide. This next slide takes a lot of liberty and a lot of analysis is needed. And to be totally clear, this is just an exercise. But if the steer ridership numbers conform to the Amtrak ridership data and 11% of their gross figures were induced, assuming the steer schedules were also employed, precluding day trips in the big markets, one train a day in this exercise would be capable of creating almost $8 million in visitor spending. So that would be over $1 million in Yakima alone. Given the presence of significant tourist draws on both sides of the mountain, this is an effective, not simply I want to give perspective. So let's move to the final slide, in my section at least. This is a lot of money. It seems like a lot of money that we're talking about here. At $280 million to $380 million for capital needs of this corridor. But we have to think about this in terms of transportation spending in the state. That same amount is nearly being dumped currently into 2 miles of a southbound HOV lane between, just north of Tacoma from Portland Avenue. Almost that exact same amount in the lower spectrum is being spent on 2 lanes of highway over 6 miles of Snoqualmie Pass. And so for the same price as a 2 or 6 mile highway project, we are getting a 400-mile passenger rail corridor that would buy immense political goodwill. This can't be underestimated. Think about it. We're talking about one set of freeway on-ramps for an entirely new corridor. These comparisons must be made early and often in the process here in order to think about this in proper perspective. I know that I'm over time, so I'll go ahead and yield, but thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this.
And thank you, Abe. Appreciate that. Really some good information there. So Luis, I'll let you make the next introduction.
Thank you. Good work there, Abe. I'd like to introduce my friend, former colleague, Representative Jake Fye, the chair of the House Transportation Committee. Recently, I've heard him discuss some of the budgetary constraints and problems we're going to have due to the COVID and also to 976 last year. And I'd like for him to now say how he's looking at the transportation budget and where something like the studies we're asking for here and the benefits of those studies might be something that he and the transportation committees would be interested in working on. Here you go, Jake.
Thank you, Luis. It's always good to see you. You're looking great, wherever you are, right? So thanks for the opportunity. So I didn't present slides, but I'm sure you folks can all remember just a few numbers. Let me just give you a sense in 2 respects. One is that we have the current shortfall in our budget from Initiative 976, which is still not resolved by the state Supreme Court. The additional estimated revenue forecast, is that a whistle? Is that a train whistle? No. Okay. The additional shortfall because of COVID approaches $500 million for this biennium, which is, we've only got we got less than 12 months left, right? So it hits pretty hard in terms of its impact. It is about the same percentage that the operating budget is short, about 7 or 8%. And the shortfall falls all over the place because people are not driving as much. So the gas tax is down significantly. The ferry system is down revenue-wise, almost $100 million. Tolling revenue, because a lot of our tolling depends upon congestion pricing, and people going to and from work is down a bit over $100 million. So there's that. We have that shortfall, but in an interesting additional impact that is probably going to make our life a bit more difficult and has a direct relationship to All Aboard Washington, is that after the 976 initiative, our largest single revenue source was car rentals and taxes on car rentals. And that is way down as well because people are not renting cars, people are not traveling, very much related to tourism. So we will have our particular challenge, I believe, will be in the area of still on our multimodal account, with now our largest single revenue source very much compromised by the lack of vacation traveling and other associated traveling where we collect our rental car tax. So in this context, we've got some additional issues that are just not going to be known for some time. And that's really related to what the new normal will be, and particularly what the new normal will be with respect to whether people will be able to stay home and work from home, and how that affects our gas tax revenues and tolling revenues, and then whether people will go back and use transit, given that those numbers are way down, and because of it's sort of like a sporting event, right? Expecting that people are going to immediately go back and get onto a bus or light rail in a very crowded situation. We don't know what the new normal will be and how long that will take to sort itself out. So for my work this interim, I'm working on some transportation proposals, and I'm at the stage where we're going to be asking for opportunities to meet with different groups to get their sense of their sense of what the issues are going forward. But certainly, here's a list of those issues that are out there. COVID and its shortfalls in revenues and what the new transportation patterns are going to be. Initiative 976, whether the state prevails and the initiative is upheld, or whether it is not upheld. We're asking ourselves about whether the car tab revenue source is one that it continues to be viable, given the number of times now that voters have rejected that. And then we have an assortment of transportation needs. First and foremost, the need for $3 billion over the next 10 years to pay for the replacement of existing culverts that have restricted or eliminated fish passage. The need for some additional projects, most particularly and foremost is the need for a new Columbia River Bridge across Columbia River from Oregon to Washington. So what I will be doing with my vice chairs and others will be doing some listening sessions to talk about these different issues and how to pay for them. Because I introduced a bill last year, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of things. If I put a tax into place of 1 cent for each year, so in 2021 it would be another cent on the gas tax, 2022 2 cents, 2023 3 cents total, and adding up to a 10-cent increase, that would only pay for culverts. It wouldn't pay for anything else. So we have some very challenging things to take a look at in the next several months, and I'll be reaching out to Luis and you folks at All Aboard Washington for an opportunity to visit with you about how you see things, what you think the investments that need to be made, how we're going to pay for them going forward, and how we're going to deal with some of these more thorny issues, as I indicated, about sorting out what the new normal is going to be for transportation, not only in the state of Washington, but of course that's going to be my focus, but really these are fundamental needs that are fundamental issues that are at least affect this whole country, if not internationally. So I don't know how what the plan was for potentially for questions, but I'm happy to respond to those as we have time available. So,
Jake, this
back
is
to you, my friend Luis.
yes, Jake. This I remember working with you. We were both co-chairs on transportation and followed you since you've become chair. And I just want to get your impression of, you've seen me talking about passenger rail for a number of years with the Rail Caucus, maybe teasing me a little bit about that too, but would you say that what you've seen today, that we're making the case for studying this a lot further and looking at what this can do for the state of Washington? I know you've got a lot of things to balance there in your portfolio, but where do you see something like the Amtrak Cascades and passenger rail being part of the eventual network that this state and actually the country is looking for now?
So here's the challenge that I have, and it's I need to do two things, Luis. Is one, I have to make sure that a number of things can survive this transitional period. And transit is one of them, and Amtrak is another. And so probably first and foremost is maintaining what we have. I have to look at that. Remember I mentioned that the shortage we have in what we call the multimodal account because of the initiative, and now the shortfall because of the rental car tax being so limited. The place where that multimodal count is what pays for special needs transportation, public transportation, rail, both Amtrak and freight rail projects. And so there was a lot of pressure on that budget with those revenues in in question now. And so I think I'm going to sort of turn it back to you folks, is we have to have Amtrak is subsidized currently. It isn't the thing we subsidize the most, but it is subsidized. And so we need a viable revenue source for multimodal and for rail as a part of that. So that's where I think the conversation needs to take place, is where can we find a source of revenue that's going to be able to take care of the shortfall and give us some room for growth, whatever that growth may happen to be. Because we can't pay for rail with the gas tax. And so we have to look at other revenue sources and potentially some brand new revenue sources to support Amtrak and those special needs transportation programs, as well as other public transportation programs.
Well,
So
I think we're running out of-
that's the big challenge is where does the money come from?
Senator
Hey.
Warnick has a question. We are running a little late, but please, Senator Warnick.
Thank you. And it wasn't actually a question. I just knew that Representative Barkas would not be on the call. So I reached out to Senator King. He pretty much said word for word what Representative Fye just said. 500 million shortfall and challenged. He used the word challenge several times when I talked to him. So I think going into this next biennium, this next budget year is going to be a challenge. So it was very interesting to listen to the report, the information from there, and very interesting to hear from what Representative Fye is thinking about going into this. So no question, just wanted to make a final statement, and I'm going to have to leave the call now, but I really appreciate being invited.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move on now to Ellen Adolph. Ellen, go ahead.
Again, thank you for attending virtual Yakima today. I did want to kind of talk a little bit about services in Yakima. And again, I appreciate our legislative participants today. Your involvement with this is key, obviously. I did want to relay that we know this is not a sprint. We don't believe it's a marathon. Maybe it's a 10K. In terms of for an analogy of the time expectations that we would at least have here in Central Washington for any kind of service to come about. That there's ample capital facilities to improve. There's issues that we are still addressing with other multimodal issues. And we won't even get into the financial aspects that by the time we could have service in place, we're hopefully well past COVID, and the legislature has dealt with 976 and any other revenue issues that have come along. We respect that, and we understand that this is a long-term effort for a even longer-term goal. I wanted to speak a little bit about transportation in our region. Since Amtrak left our area in October of '81, the Central Washington area has gradually lost many different modes of transportation. As I mentioned, passenger rail left in 1981. The Yakima Air Terminal has had United Express and Delta Express come and go. They came with significant economic support by local communities and left only due to national economic restrictions, the latest being Delta about 10 years ago during the Great Recession. Today we do operate the Horizon Alaska service. It's the only provider that comes in and out of Yakima. But we often lose ridership out of the airport for Yakima because of the significant delay times that often are associated with flying to Seattle, waiting for flights to the Pacific Rim or the East Coast, that are much more easily handled by driving to Pasco. We do run certain risks or fears that, depending on how the economics of the next decade or so turn out, do we even lose that service? Greyhound operated a local depot in Yakima until 2012. That shut down. Since then, a variety of convenience stores have acted as our depot. There's also a pickup location in the city of Sunnyside, but even those hours are not convenient for a vast majority of our users and residents in the area, which has made that a less attractive form of transportation. We do have public transit in Yakima County. However, it is a patchwork quilt. We have 3 independent city transit services. We have a DOT, public rural transportation grant funded community connector service that runs basically along Highway 97 and 82. And the Yakima Nation has been running their tribal transit program since, I believe, 2007. None of it is frequent enough to be optimally used. And based on those limited service opportunities, interconnectivity is difficult. So we are in the process of working on a feasibility study that should be out sometime next year on best practices on potentially how to bring countywide transportation into Yakima County. We are the largest county in the state without any kind of countywide transit services. We do have Airporter transit service, which runs from Yakima to SeaTac, and that service is much appreciated. It does make several stops along I-90 and I-5 to get to SeaTac. However, that is susceptible to pass closures that, depending on how well a rail system across Stampede Pass is maintained, you are more likely to see continued rail service depending on snowfall and any of those other impacts being able to cross when potentially, due to ice and accident closures on I-90, that would be our only means of crossing the Cascades for any kind of transit or transportation service. Yakima does not have any direct access of service of any kind to Portland, Tacoma, Spokane, Boise, or any of the other major metropolitan areas in the area. Outside, again, as I mentioned, Greyhound, where you do face numerous stopovers or stops along the way, in which train service is in some cases, and that was leading to my question during the first hour, the potential of increased ridership because you're looking at a more direct, shorter time interval option with services between the Tri-Cities and Seattle. Yakima County understands that it does not make sense that service alone from Yakima or anywhere along the Stampede Pass route justifies a route. It makes more sense as part of a regional effort that what's going on with Aorta, with bringing Boise, potentially Salt Lake City into more of a country regional effort, not just a state regional effort, it is actually a more likely way to be successful, and we would be more than happy to participate in a far larger pond of effort to bring these services along. The last item on terms of services, about 2 years ago, Yakima was a candidate for a new intercity transit route. There are currently 4 in the state, spread all over the 4 corners. This would have been a connection potentially from Yakima to Biggs, which would then connect to bus service that would travel along I-84 to Portland or places east as part of the Greyhound DOT partnership. But that has been on hold at least since 976 started to rear its head, and definitely I think is on hold pending any COVID impacts. In terms of public support, we did complete our quad-annual long-range plan effort, and part of that was a survey where we went out to the general public. I'll keep this short and wrap up here for any questions. 9 out of 10 respondents supported a return of passenger rail to the Yakima region. 8 of 10 support our local elected officials to begin work and effort to provide that service back to here. 9 out of 10 of the respondents said they would actually would use service. And again, some of my questions from the first hour were, I definitely agree, additional analysis and research needs to be looked into is where would people go? Only 60% said that they would travel in central and eastern Washington. 2/3 would travel Oregon, California, or the Rockies. 82% would go to Western Washington, and there's probably a larger anecdotal expectation, definitely for Seahawks games, potentially for Sounder games, and for Mariner and the Kraken, or whatever our new hockey team will be called. There would be substantial interest in traffic using the train to get there. And a secondary concern that we would have is we do have a lot of chartered buses that will travel from central and eastern Washington to sporting events. Those buses are clogging up downtown Seattle, causing delays on the interstate. Being able to have trains come into the station and go to these events would definitely help the long-term cost of transportation network issues in the metropolitan Seattle area. Likewise, the Yakima County area and Central Washington is a very popular location for statewide events in terms of sports, recreation, camping, and other things that makes it very conducive to loading your stuff onto the train and unloading it to go and perform your recreational activities. Last little part in terms of where they would go, and again, this was looking beyond Spokane. 60% of people would be interested in traveling places east or elsewhere in the United States or elsewhere in North America, including Mexico and Canada. So there would be, I would have to agree with Abe in some of his analysis that there is the potential for far greater ridership than the initial survey would lead us to forecast at this point. I'll stop at that point if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate that. There's John Robert Smith. I thought we lost him for a minute. So we'll have questions at the time, Alan, at the end, if there is time available there. Let's move on to John Robert Smith with Transportation for America. And he has some very interesting suggestions about establishing rail commissions. Mr. Smith, please.
Very good, thank you. And it's my pleasure to join you. And when I say I wish I could be with you personally in Washington State, I am sincere because I am speaking to you from South Louisiana with a heat index of 109 outside. So as you can see, I've spent my adult life around passenger rail. I served 16 years as the mayor of my hometown, Meridian, Mississippi, which created the South's first multimodal transportation center now about 30 years ago. I was appointed to the Amtrak Board of Directors and served the last 2 years of my term as chairman of the board. I also chair Transportation for America, and we are the federal affairs advisor for the Southern Rail Commission that I'll speak to their efforts in just a moment. Next slide. Transportation for America is a national alliance of local leaders, elected business and chamber leaders alike, to see that those transportation visions at the local and regional level are heard and incorporated at the state and federal level. Because if you live in a city or a region whose only connectivity is basically the automobile, you're very limited in your economic development future. And we have reports that can show that painful reality. We also want to see that you have a financial partner at the state and federal level. Next slide. So those of us at T4A have strong relationships with the chairman and ranking members of every committee of jurisdiction over passenger rail in both the House and the Senate. And it is due to that kind of effort that we were able to achieve passenger rail in the surface transportation bill for the first time in the history of the country. We have highways, we have transit, now we have passenger rail in the FAST Act. And working with Senator Wicker from Mississippi and Senator Booker from New Jersey, we created two important funding streams within the FAST Act. One is the CRISI grant, one is the R&E grant. Next slide. The CRISI grant, or Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, is where you would go to get matching funds for the capital needed to invest in the infrastructure to expand or renew passenger rail. And you can see the appropriations level from 67 million to 325 million. Those are competitive. Next slide. The Restoration and Enhancement Grant Program provides the operating support. So you have CRISI for capital, you have R&E for operating, so that the federal government supplies 80% of operating needs the first year of operation, 60% the second, 40% the third, giving a new service or expanded service the time to build its brand and get on its feet. And it's been appropriated from 5 million to 27 million. Next slide. And of course, we're aware, and you've talked about it today, of the COVID pandemic and economic recession and its impact on all forms of transportation. Amtrak ridership in particular is down 90% nationally, with the Northeast Corridor in May down 97%, the state-supported trains down 89%. But look at the long-distance trains. They're down the least, 71%. And in fact, in May, the long-distance trains produced more gross revenue to Amtrak than the Northeast Corridor or state-supported trains combined. And the ridership is returning fastest on the long-distance trains. Next slide. So in the midst of this, Amtrak received a little over $1 billion in the CARES Act, as you're probably aware, but they have come back to Congress and said we need a supplemental appropriation of $1.45 billion more. And for that, we're going to reduce our staff by 4,000 people. Now that's getting into the meat and bone of the company. And we're going to cut service across the country. And state-supported trains will be especially hard hit, and long-distance trains will all be reduced, and that includes the Empire Builder, to 3 days a week or 4 days a week, except the auto train, which runs down the East Coast of Florida. You don't go to your appropriators and say, give me $1.45 billion, and I'm going to fire 4,000 people and cut all service to the bone. And if you don't give me that, I'll cut it out altogether. That's not a negotiating point, and the members of Congress are not pleased with that, I can tell you. Next slide. So, good news. The House has passed their INVEST Act. The TRAIN Act was a part of it, with authorizing $60 billion over 5 years for passenger rail. They created a new grant program, the Prime Grant, $19 billion over 5 years. Look at what they've done with CRISI. They bumped it up to $5.8 billion over 5 years and appropriated $500 million in FY21 for that program, and up the R&E grants to $100 million. And then they provide the credit risk premium for RIF loans. Next slide. Amtrak specific They created 6.2 billion authorization for the national network. That's long distance trains and state supported trains, and 13 billion for the Northeast corridor. They gave an 8 billion emergency appropriation, and you see the split there, but they also give power to Amtrak on the on-time performance issue, to seek on-time performance through the courts or through the Surface Transportation Board, and that's a big positive change for passenger rail. Next slide. Of that 8 billion I mentioned in emergency funding for Amtrak, divided 5 billion for the Northeast corridor and 3 billion for the national network, they specifically tied, if Amtrak's going to get that money, they're going to have to maintain service at the 2018 level across the country, days of the week, 7 days a week, and maintain the existing staffing levels. Because if you reduce service when you get ready to return it and you fired 4,000 employees, you won't have the staff to be able to do it. So Congress is tying the money to maintaining the service and the staffing level. Next slide. On what's happening on the Senate side, they have yet to act, but they've introduced a bill on the Democrat side, $5 billion annually for passenger rail. We're working with the committee on expanding what counts as a non-federal match, obviously on work on the RIF loan process. But if you'll notice the last bullet point, in the Senate, we'll create additional interstate commissions who will have federal match. Now, I mentioned the Southern Rail Commission. That is one of the only federally created interstate commissions. Next slide. So this is the Southern Rail Commission, created by an act of Congress for Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The commissioners are appointed by the governors of those 3 states. And once appointed, they can act autonomously. So when they go to apply for a grant from the federal government under CRISI or R&E grant, they can do so directly. They don't have to go through the state DOT. They don't have to go through their governor. Obviously, they need the matching funds to do so, but they act autonomously. And we think this is a critical issue and could be very, very helpful for your broader regional view. Next slide. In fact, they've been very successful in accessing both the CRISI grant for capital and the R&E grant for operating. And we will soon be starting service again from New Orleans to Mobile, twice daily service, every station getting 4 stops a day, and have put together the money to make that possible with our federal partners. Next slide. So we have reached out to other corridors that I am aware that have lost service over the past 20 or 30 years and have long sought to return that service. And we have Dave Strohmeyer, Commissioner from Missoula County, which is actually on your conference this afternoon. And we've worked with Dave, we've worked with friends in Idaho, and within Montana, they're creating the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, but they're looking to join that to Idaho and then North Dakota to create this multi-state region and to seek to be one of the new commissions created by Congress and receiving the matching funds. So the 3 states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana put up about $220,000 a year. If they had dollar-for-dollar matching funds, which we're asking from the feds within the Senate bill, they'd be talking about almost $450,000 a year to put towards their efforts. And Dave, you're on. I know that both Senator Daines and Senator Tester are aware of that, and I understand they have already begun to reach out to Commerce staff. Next slide. We've also done a similar thing with West Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana. Those are some of the routes you might see there. In fact, I have a call Tuesday with Senator Manchin's office. We have sent the language that created the Southern Rail Commission to them. They're very interested in such a commission, certainly through West Virginia, but connecting into Virginia and then on into Ohio and Indiana. Next slide. So these are some of the the routes that All Aboard Washington has been talking about. And keep in mind, with the Southern Rail Commission, it's not just about new routes, it's about sustaining the city of New Orleans and the Crescent, which serve those three states, as well as the Sunset Limited headed west out of New Orleans. But it also gives them the authority to commit funds and to apply for grants to create new connections, as I've described. So with the ability to create a new commission and seek federal matching funds and position yourself to apply for CRISI and R&E grants and capital and support, and the new Prime grant program, which I know Commerce staff on the Senate side also likes very much. You should know that I believe there will be a federal partner that is getting serious about providing matching funds at significant levels to states that want to cooperate together to build off of the long distance national system, interconnecting smaller corridors that make sense for their communities, their region, and the cities that they serve. So I also am painfully aware of what is happening to Essential Air Service. We've lost 80% of our intercity bus service. So think what that would mean to your community, your region, if Essential Air Service is either lost or virtually non-existent. You lose your intercity bus service and you have no passenger rail service. That doesn't position you well for a healthy economic future, and we intend to see that doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you, John Robert, for taking the time today away from your family just to be here with us and share your wonderful knowledge. Thank you very much. Louis Mosso, do you have a couple of minutes that you can quickly tell us about another funding possibility here in the state of Washington called county rail districts? We've only got a couple of minutes, so we'll have to move right on. Louis, where are you? Are you muted?
There we go.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. This is Louis Musso from Cle Elum. I'm going to cut this way back, but it's really all we need to talk about. If I leave you with two thoughts, number one is, after listening to a Representative Bai and Senator Warnick and other discussions we've had, I am reminded of the words of wisdom of Cyndi Lauper, that money changes everything. And that's the situation we're in. We have a way of financing essentially the entire amount that the Steer report says would be necessary if we engage in a bit of legislative consilience, that is, combining two existing programs, two existing concepts in a way of that was not expected when they were begun, that accomplishes this. We are going to be posting the details to the All Aboard Washington page. That's the only way I can get you the information quickly. County rail districts were created by the state legislature in the 1980s. In the early 2000s, we in Kittitas County expanded that legislative authority to include passenger as well as freight. At the same time, the legislature created a funding mechanism for public facilities districts, which is no longer in effect, but under that legislation, state money was made available from the state's share of the existing sales tax to build things like the Town Toyota Center in Wenatchee, the Spokane Arena, the Yakima Sun Dome, and a number of other facilities across the state. What this proposal would do would be provide that same funding mechanism to county rail districts. And if we do have a county rail district in Kittitas County, that same funding mechanism would raise approximately $5 million a year. In Grant County, it would raise approximately $20 million a year. I have not run the numbers for Adams, which is Ritzville, or Lincoln, but take a look at this. And anybody who's still listening, who is interested in this sort of thing, take a look at what we post and tear it apart. If I am wrong, let me know. But if I am right, then let us work together to get this done in the next legislative session. No new taxes, no new level of government, but a method of funding what we all know needs to be funded. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Luis Moscoso, would you like to take just about 3 minutes we have left to summarize? And what do we do next?
Yeah, why don't we move to slide 50, I think. We're not going to have time to go through all the other ones. And want to thank everyone for listening in. What do we need to do? I think what we've proven today is that not only interest in this particular corridor, but in looking at a statewide passenger rail system is really something that we've got to bring on the table quickly now. We've spent the better part of 30 years due to budget cuts and other things, not really following through on the original vision and promise that we had back in '93 when the legislature started this whole passenger rail system that they wanted to have by this year, 2020, and 2030, they were expecting to have rail to Spokane. Well, maybe that's 10 years from now, we might just be able to meet that goal given what we've heard today. So we need to really have an economic impact analysis. What we've heard from Abe and now Louis and what John Roberts said before, so much more about the benefits of this rail system that have not really been delved into to the extent that they need to be done. So we really have to get that impact statement. I know from some of the research we've done now, it would be a lot less expensive than even the last research that was done, but I guess that depends on how much work they're going to be doing. We recognize that the budget, the transportation budget and the state budget are not what they need to be in order to accomplish this. But I think what we have to do is to show people that this is viable and that since we're going to a national and interstate rail system anyway, why don't we keep looking at how we can catch up to where we thought we would be 30 years ago. Next slide. And yeah, we're down to 2 minutes or so here. Most of you know the drill here of contacting legislators and anyone else, public officials. All aboard will be conducting a number of public meetings in Eastern Washington, virtually to start with until the COVID's over, but as soon as we can get back on the road, several of us will be out there wanting to meet in person with folks in Eastern Washington to be sure they understand what we've learned today and what more we'd be able to add to this report. I just want to remind people that this isn't an extra thing we're trying to do now. This is so important to our economy and to transportation in general. And I would really welcome everyone's support in going forward with this and working with all the different folks who've been on this call today, meeting up with our friends in Aorta and Oregon, as well as Dave out there in Montana and others. We've got to look at this regionally, as well as how to motivate our legislatures and the public to move faster on this matter. Sorry I'm talking so fast, but I'm looking at the clock. I think I'm down to a couple of seconds.
Thank you, Luis. We appreciate all that. And we're about to sign off here, but if folks want to stay on after 3 o'clock, we can do a question and answer session then. So thank you everyone for attending.
Wow.
So are there questions? Patrick, I'll turn it over to you. Do we have any Any chat questions, or if anybody wants to post something, we can do it just live online here. Are there questions for John Robert? He's still out with us.
I would just like to make a comment, if I may. You know, Chairman DeFazio did a yeoman's job in the House T&I committee, and that's why you have the authorization and funding levels on the House side. Thank him. You know, electeds like to be thanked. And then you have Senator Cantwell, who is ranking on commerce and works with my Senator Wicker, who is chair, and they work together extremely well. Share with her your needs for your regional connectivity. You know, she has expressed interest in the new commission idea. She'll be a strong player in what the Senate does. So make sure she is hearing from you. And again, thank her for that support that she's already given. We too often go in and ask an elected official for something, and they want to hear thank you first, then ask.
That's a good point. Thank you for that.
Thank you, John
John
Robert.
Roberts, this is Luis, and Senator Cantwell is our senator out here in Washington, as you know. You're speaking of a regional commission. Is that the one she's interested in?
Yes, these 5 additional commissions. She was so interested, and I'm sure the fact that the chair from Mississippi, you know, she knows how to play that well. But when the Southern Rail Commission came, one from Alabama, one from Mississippi, one from Louisiana, we take them on all their Hill visits. And Senator Cantwell spent the better part of an hour herself with these 3 commissioners from states about as far from Washington State as you can get. But she was very much interested in the additional interstate commissions, multi-state commissions, and how that might play out in the greater Washington region. But she's going to have a great deal to say.
So, John Robert, if I understand you correctly, the legislation exists now that we could establish 5 more. Is that correct?
Yes, the Southern Rail Commission set the precedent. They were the first created a number of years ago. What Senator Wicker's staff, the Commerce staff, is working with their fellow members on will be creating what we have asked for 5 additional commissions on top of the Southern Rail Commission. And each commission getting dollar for dollar federal matching funds to whatever the states give to the commission, up to $500,000 per commission. So if you had 3 or 4 states that put in $500,000 annually, the feds would match it with $500,000. Now you've got $1 million to operate with. One other thing, and I know Dave's working this, and I know West Virginia's working this, is within the Commerce, create a working group and have the feds pay for the analysis that you're talking about doing. That's what we did. The Gulf Coast Working Group was created in the FAST Act with $1 million appropriated for the work of the Gulf Coast Working Group. And that was led by the Federal Railroad Administration, and they did the analysis of ridership, revenue, capital cost, all of that across the Gulf. And I can put you in touch with the college that did the analysis for the Gulf Coast. And when you look at the return, for example, to the state of Mississippi, it's $248 million a year in additional revenue once this train starts running annually.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a comment. If the rail service in Central Washington is restored, I think there needs to be some additional infrastructure to go along with that. In particular, if I take the train from Pasco to Toppenish in order to go to some of the vineyards there, I want to rent a car there. So we need some, I think we need to also look into what else could enhance the return of rail to Central Washington. Thank you.
Any other comments?
And we have Commissioner Strohmeyer wants to make a comment.
Yeah, greetings everyone, and thanks for hosting this All Aboard Washington. This is a great event, and I think will certainly help build some momentum throughout the region. I would say, and this was referenced by John Robert Smith, we have been lobbying hard for one of these regional multi-state rail commissions to be located here in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. If folks would be interested, and I can route this to whoever with All Aboard Washington would be most appropriate, we have examples of letters that we have sent to our congressional delegation, specifically our 2 U.S. senators, urging them to do exactly what has been mentioned previously. Establish a regional multi-state rail authority, or rail commission, I should say, modeled after the Southern Rail Commission in our geographic region, and also create something like the Gulf Coast Working Group to also, on a parallel path, further our efforts up here. I would also just add, and I put this in the chat, that we will be hosting a passenger rail summit of our own, the Montana Passenger Rail Summit on September 17th. It will be a virtual event, and folks can find out more information on that at montanapassengerrailsummit.org. So thanks again for all of your work.
Any other comments? Hearing none, thank you everyone for attending. I think we're off to a great start, and I hope we can keep this momentum going. Charlie, you have anything in closing?
Well, just as we said earlier, we are posting everything that we worked on today. We will have the slides. We will have a recording at aawa.us/east-west, east-west, aawa.us/east-west, or just go to our homepage and it's in the menu. So thanks to Patrick for putting this together, and we look forward to talking to everyone again soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Charlie, is there any way we could go over the dates for the train track real quick?
Sure. Let me share the screen again.
Because I know at the last minute it was a little bit busy there, but yes, like we mentioned, we will be hosting a series of events with focuses on several of the stops along the route on both sides of the mountains, but especially in the Yakima Valley and Eastern Washington. So that's going to start off after this meeting. We are planning in August to host a discussion about Spokane, August 27th. That's going to be a Thursday. The next discussion is going to be about Ellensburg on Saturday, September 19th. Preceding that will be the Tri-Cities. Believe it or not, there are actually 2 train stations in the Tri-Cities. One of them is being used and one of them is not. On October 17th, that'll be a Saturday. Then Cle Elum on Saturday, November 21st, which does not have an existing station, but it's absolutely beautiful little town right in the heart of the mountains. Then finally, for now, we have Saturday, December 5th planned. Now these dates, are subject to change in case anything happens to come up, but this is what we are planning for now. And we would absolutely love to see you come back and join the discussion, listen in and contribute your ideas to that. So beyond that, I don't know, did we have a discussion of I think the 4 main steps that everyone watching this meeting can do to to help out with the East-West project, Charlie? I think we talked about that.
We did, but it certainly doesn't hurt to say it again. We really do need everyone to get involved. And as Luis said very briefly there at the end, we do have a number of things that need to happen, and we need your help to make that happen. And so these are the things that we're asking people to do. Please contact your legislators and ask them to support the economic analysis that we were talking about, and to get state approval for a Northwest Rail Commission. On the local level, there were many years ago, there was a series of resolutions of support that were counties and cities put in, and we'd like to have that happen again. And talk to them about county rail districts, what Louis talked about earlier. We wouldn't mind having a little funding, or join us as a member or a volunteer or a director. And we also really need people in the central and eastern part of the state to create local chapters or local groups that working on the important issues that face your community. This is a statewide organization, and while we do everything we can to be statewide, sometimes it really helps just to have people in local areas. And then, as we said, participate in our upcoming events. So
Charlie, it would be nice to get our contact information to Commissioner Dave Strohmeyer so we could get a hold of those letters that he was referring to that we could use as samples.
Yes.
Help establish the Rail Commission.
Yes, good idea.
In that same vein, Gary and Charlie, I know we're working up some kind of a report on what happened today, and looking at, I guess, what might be called proceedings, or at least the highlights, because those are the kind of things we're going to want to share with as many people as possible, beyond just the social media and web pages we might put reports on. We need to send this directly to a lot of our contacts beyond our membership to let them know that something's really happening here, and take the lead with our legislators and with the Rail Caucus. I'll also follow up on those contacts that John Roberts said with our federal delegations, and make sure that we can get that information so they know we're working on the same things, and that we can share that also with our larger community of supporters and gin up as much interest and enthusiasm as possible.
Great.
Thank everyone for participating. We really appreciate it.
Good job, everybody.
Thanks,
Love it.
everybody. Signing off
Thank
now.
you.
Bye.